Super Mario RPG is one of the best games we ever got. It's not just one of the best games we got on the SNES, but one of the very best, period. Developed in 1996 by Square Enix and published by Nintendo, this was Mario's very first appearance in 3D. We also got a lot of unique characters, and a lot of unique gameplay with the turn-based battle system, the amazing storyline, and the fact that Bowser isn't the main villain, but a playable character. The new remake that we got for the Switch not only brings this game back in all its glory, but modernizes it in terms of graphics, difficulty, and quality of life aspects, with only a few changes to the actual game, such as with the battle system. But just how well does this remake hold up to the original game? We can say for sure that it holds up very well, to say the least, with the nostalgic value and the new value that it provides, but just how much justice does the remake do the original? This video contains spoilers for the Switch remake of the game, so with that said, let's dive right in. The original game paved the way for other RPG genres of the Mario franchise, namely the Paper Mario series and the Mario & Luigi RPG series, each with their own quirky characters and turn-based battle systems. None of those would probably exist or be the way they were if not for the first Mario RPG. Now, the reason we want to know how well the remake holds up to the original is not just because of the huge time gap, but also because of how times have changed since then, especially with the Mario Mandate, aka Nintendo's unwillingness to go into uncharted territory with its RPG characters instead of sticking to its own guns with characters that fit the Super Mario brand. May I remind you that these games were developed by Square Enix, and they're known for their RPG games. It's easy to tell that the remake is indeed faithful to its source material on the surface, but we want to know exactly how much so. There's also the quality of life aspect. Video games that came out decades ago had nowhere near as many quality of life aspects and or user friendliness as the more recent games, partly because of the limitations in not just the hardware, but people's way of thinking when it comes to implementation of these conveniences. The remake does have more quality of life aspects that make it more playable and user friendly compared to the original, but we want to know just how much so. This aspect also plays very well into the next aspect I'm going to point out, and that is the difficulty aspect. The difficulty standards for video games 3 decades ago were different than they are today. People had to get very good at games in order to beat them the way they were intended, and over the years games have generally gotten much easier, so that more and more people could beat them and less people would have to resort to finding ways to cheat, which is something that has universally and always been frowned upon, much more so in multiplayer. The Switch remake can in fact be set to an easier difficulty level called Breezy, so there's something for new players who want to enjoy the game without too much challenge, as well as something for the more experienced players. But just how much easier is the remake in general when you compare it to the original? First of all, I won't be pointing out the more obvious differences like the updated HD graphics, music, interface, and so forth. Some of the aspects of the original game did not translate well into the remake, on account of the original game's limitations. This was mainly the characters' movements and reactions. There was only so much they could do with the original game, and it's exactly that much that they used as a base for the remake. Being too faithful to the original is exactly what caused remakes like Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl to fail. However, the changes and differences the remake has versus the original game can also have a negative impact, depending on what they are and how everyone feels about them to a subjective degree. Finding the right balance between faithfulness and modernization is the key to a successful remake. Fortunately, the remake adds cutscenes to the game, which are very nice to look at and are excellent replacements for the way that these movements were handled in the original game. On the other hand, it can be so jarring just how faithful the remake is to the SNES classic, like how they didn't omit Easter eggs like Peach's question mark, for example. The remake added triple moves, a battle aspect that was absent from the original game. Every time you pulled off action commands, it would fill a small gauge on the lower left corner. When it got to 100%, depending on which 3 characters you had, you would pull off a triple move with those 3 characters. Since Mario was always the head of the party and could not be switched out, There are a total of 6 triple moves between the interchanging of the other 4 characters that you can use. Now's the part where game spoilers really kick in, so continue watching at your own risk if you haven't beaten the game yet. The remake also has post-game content which lets you fight stronger bosses that the original game did not have, for better weapons that the original also did not have. All this new content is triggered after you beat the final boss the first time. Apparently the remake reverses the status quo by having everything after the final save block be all Mario's dream. I'll leave it up to you to figure that one out. When I first heard about this new edition, I thought maybe they introduced completely new bosses and or characters. Something completely new that goes beyond simply remaking and reusing what was made and established before. But no, that wasn't the case. This new content somehow just completely reuses what the original game had. This was the perfect opportunity for them to give us completely new content that tied well into Mario RPG, but no. Guess we'll have to wait and see if they give us a new game. At least this post-game content fits into the status quo prior to the final boss. Since Mario RPG is still one of those games where beating the final boss defeats the status quo, yes, getting the 7th star ends the game, so that last slot right there in the middle remains empty. Anyway, the post-game boss fights fit well into the game without deviating too far from the source material, and each one is hard in its own way. There was also talk of an optional super boss that comes at the end of these fights. I thought the super boss at least would be 100% new and unique from the original game, but no. Are you ready? The super boss is a 3D Kulex, a 3D version of the optional boss from the original game. The fact that the first time you fight Kulex in the remake as a 2D boss is the biggest clue to 3D Kulex being the super boss and majorly foreshadows it, since the dialogue when meeting Kulex is different, and Kulex talks about being 3D like everyone else. It is absolutely intriguing that Kulex is a much harder, much stronger boss in 3D than in 2D, while every other boss prior to the post-game plays similarly, 3D or not. The music you hear when meeting Kulex for the first or second time also plays into all this. There's a lot of name changes from the original game, notably Peach being referred to as Peach in the remake and not Toadstool. Nintendo seems to have stopped using the word Toadstool to such a degree that the Mario Party 3 minigame Toadstool Titan got a name change in later games that reused this minigame. But anyway, some items and bosses also got name changes. Great Guys Casino gets an overhaul in the remake. It's now much less like an actual casino. Now, all the games are free! There's no gambling aspect like the original game, on account of how gambling is handled in video games today, especially after Luigi's Casino minigames in the DS era, but moving on. Look the Other Way is unchanged, but now the triple slot minigame is free and gives items instead of frog coins. And they replaced Blackjack with a memory game. The original Blackjack minigame was lacking in a proper user interface anyway. Seriously, how does Great Guy make any money off his casino in the remake? All the games are free now, and you can play for items, good items like Red Essence and the one-time Star Egg, but not for money! It's the people who played the original that can worry about this and all its details. Let's move on. Speaking of money, there is now a higher coin cap for both regular coins and frog coins. Items also stack better, and much more so in Breezy mode, not to mention the storage box at Mario's house for excess items. Game-breaking exploits in the SNES Classic, like the one with the Invincibility Star, were also removed to balance gameplay in the Switch remake. They also added a journal which contains a sound test mode for listening to music tracks from the game, both for the original and the remake, which is unlocked after you beat the game, and some songs required you to meet certain conditions, namely going to the parts of the game where they play. There's also a monster list similar to the title logbook from Paper Mario Thousand Year Door, which keeps track of every enemy that Mallow used his peak magic ability on. In the original game, using Mallow to peak was completely optional, and in the remake it still is, but now the logbook gives players a good reason to do it. It's insane how the logbook even tracks all the different variations of enemies, whether it's the different parts of the box Exor, or all the missing Axum Rangers, and heck, even Eurytovich or Spiritovich's duplicate has its own entry. Missing any of these with no way of being able to challenge these enemies or bosses again means having to grind frog coins to pay a completely unseen NPC and booster pass behind a wall next to a hidden switch to fill those entries in, if you want to 100% the game. The journal also adds the scrapbook that logs moments in the game, and the play report that has things like minigame records and even how far you've come with the 100 jump challenge and the hidden blocks. Everything I mentioned after the changes with Great Guys Casino also go into the next aspect I want to talk about. Like a lot of old games, the original Mario RPG lacked a bunch of things that could have been very convenient even then, that at least we got in the remake. For example, the prompts for the action commands in battle. The original didn't have these, but now the remake does, which also makes the timing much easier in the remake than the first game. This also makes it much easier to achieve the infamous 100 consecutive super jumps needed to get the super suit in the late game. Since there's a counter on the screen that shows you how far you've gotten, something that the original game did not have, which made it very hard to tell. You would have to make it all the way to Monstro Town and talk to the child there to know the exact highest number of jumps you got, whereas the remake will tell you as you're doing it and even lets you know if you've made it to 100. Remember that hidden block in the first room of Peach's castle that was missable in the original game? The one where you had to get on Toad's head and jump on top before he was gone? If you didn't get this block when you had the chance, then you could never get it again, and that NPC in Monstro Town named Chester will always tell you that you missed one. Which is extremely frustrating since you have to start a completely new game if you missed it. Now in the remake, you get to this hidden block the same way, but if you missed it, now later in the game there will always be a Toad hanging around there whose head you can jump on to reach the area. It also helps that the area is now visually more distinguishable, whereas in the remake it wasn't because of how it blended into everything else. Thanks Nintendo and Square for fixing this mistake, if you can call it that, 27 years later. Also, they moved one hidden box with red essence in the section after you follow Geno through the maze. You also get the signal ring earlier in the remake, whereas where you get the signal ring in the original, you now get an echo signal ring, which beeps the closer you are to the exact location in the room that the box is hidden at. Switching out party members in the middle of battle is something the original didn't have, so this is not only convenient but can make the battle easier too. On the other hand, the monster log means the added inconvenience of having to use Mallow's peak ability more often than you typically would. Though at least this is optional, but will mean more frog coin grinding the less it's done, as previously stated. Besides the overall game difficulty, the options menu gives the player the necessary options to customize their experience as much as possible, either to be more like the original game or more practical, especially with the game's music. It's also really good that they added fast travel options to the remake. No more traversing all the way across the map to reach certain areas, much less traversing all the way through a single area to reach certain places. Remember in the original game when players had to do a lot of backtracking through Smithy's factory in order to leave if they wanted to go back and do things like side quests and maxing out their level, and then going through the whole level again to go back to the final boss every single time? Remember how tedious that was? Not anymore, thankfully, in the remake. The original game only had the difficulty level that it had, but the remake has two difficulty levels, normal and breezy. Normal is for players who want to experience the game the way the original is experienced, and breezy is for players who want the game to be easier so they can get through it better and progress the story. Breezy has several aspects that makes it easier than normal, all of which are listed on the screen where you select the difficulty setting. But even normal doesn't play 100% identically to the original game, though it does provide a similar enough experience. For example, the timing for the action commands in battle. The original game had strict timing that required precise button presses, but now the remake is more generous with its timing. And the prompts they added for the timing also helps a lot. The 100 super jump challenge is easier too, since the timing is a lot less strict, and players can, for example, follow Mario's shadow to help maintain the timing. Don't get me wrong, this challenge is still hard to do, and I'm still questioning how they could let something this hard into the remake out of faithfulness to the original game, as subjective as that is, with some people telling you that it's easy while others believing it's still hard, but we can be grateful that it's not downright sadistic like in the original game. Breezy mode, of course, makes action commands easier to pull off, even for the 100 jump challenge. Triple moves being a thing in the remake also made battles easier to a degree, as well as switching out party members mid-battle and multi-target damage, whereas the optional requirement of the monster log and having to use Mallow's peak ability on everything to fill it up artificially adds difficulty. Everything previously mentioned but the gameplay and the quality of life aspects also come into effect with the difficulty. All of these things previously mentioned played into just how well the Mario RPG remake lives up to the original SNES Classic version. We know that the remake does enough justice to the original to satisfy enough people, but exactly how much so? Does the remake really hold up to the original game? Can we really say that this remake brings back enough of what made the original game so great, while simultaneously introducing plenty of new elements, minimizing the problems the original had while not creating any new ones in the remake? The short answer is yes. And to answer the question of exactly how well it holds up, the short answer is very well. Now, obviously the remake isn't perfect. It doesn't fix every single problem the original game had, and it does give us a few new problems, though most of these new problems are really just things in the form of new challenges, and our view of just how Nintendo and Square re-implement something from years ago in terms of how it was then and what they'll do now is very shaken. But the fact of the matter is that it's all very highly suggestive, since there are the old players who grew up on the original or are at least familiar with it, and there are the new players who have never even heard of the original game or that there even was one. Everybody has a different overall perspective on the matter, and not everybody thinks the same way of it. So the exact measurement of how well the remake holds up to the original is not just based on the content itself and the hard facts associated with it, but it's also really up to us, the players who have played one or both versions of the game. Super Mario RPG is an amazing game that we're glad we grew up with, one of the best on the SNES, and we're even more glad that they decided to bring it back on the Switch. The way Nintendo and Square brought this game back on the Switch nearly 3 decades later, given all the factors that were in play, was amazing for the most part, and many of us are more satisfied than dissatisfied about the things that they kept and the things they didn't. I had a lot of fun playing the original game, and I also had a lot of fun playing the remake. Both of these experiences having their similarities and differences, and in spite of all the comparisons of the Switch remake to the classic SNES version, I think the Switch remake really holds up to the original. What about you? What are your thoughts? Do you think the Mario RPG remake holds to the original very well? Is there anything you think they could have done, or anything you wish they hadn't? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to leave a like, and if you want more from this channel, hit that subscribe button. And be sure to check out my other videos on this channel. Thank you for watching, and have a great rest of your day!